European bison has moved a step back from the brink of extinction. The largest land mammal was almost wiped out by hunting and deforestation.
Long ago, these mighty giants roamed Europe's lush forests in great herds, shaping meadows, spreading seeds, and carving secret trails. But centuries of hunting and destruction nearly wiped them out forever. Their wild strongholds disappeared, leaving behind only empty glades and silent hillsides. Conservationists fought to save them, hoping one day they might return. Fast forward to today, a bold, unlikely plan is unfolding deep in the Tarcu Mountains. What happens next will surprise you. The forest was dying, the soil exhausted, and villagers doubted anything could change. Yet, as the bison took their first cautious steps into this forgotten landscape, nature itself began to stir. And no one could believe what came next. The decline of European bison. Long before cities and railroads crisscrossed Europe, European bison roamed freely across a continent blanketed in wild forests and grasslands. From the lush forests of France to the towering peaks of the Caucasus, these massive herbivores thrived by shaping their surroundings. They grazed expansively, clearing patches of dense undergrowth, spreading seeds through their fur and dung, and carving trails that other animals would follow. This roaming created a mosaic of habitats and ensured that Europe's wild spaces were diverse and rich in plant and animal life. Bison were intertwined with the landscape. They were a moving force of nature itself. But the slow rise of human civilization began to unravel this balance. By the Middle Ages, new villages and farms sprouted across Europe as agriculture took hold and forest edges crept ever inward. Deforestation accelerated as land was cleared for crops and livestock, breaking up the vast wild territories that bison had relied on. Even those populations that survived became isolated and trapped in shrinking forest refuges, their numbers declining steadily as their habitat was chipped away, piece by piece, over centuries. During the 18th and 19th centuries, when firearms were invented, they proved to be most devastating to the entire hunt. The once dangerous and skillful undertaking became effortless with rifles. Deer, bison, or really none were now hailed as the crown giants of the woods. These were no more than trophies, and meat turned into dominion symbols for man. The bison was sport hunted by noblemen, and full herds were slaughtered to feed armies. This animal had weathered glaciations and changing climates, but it soon foundered under industrialized hunting and free exploitation. Finally, World War I brought a near political and economic disaster to the population. The virtual last remaining wild herds were found in the Białowieża forest areas, a dense and historically protective forest covering modern-day Poland and Belarus. But as the war raged, these forests were devastated as German troops cut timber and hunted bison for food. During the last stages of the war, the last few founding animals were reincorporated within their species limits, and extinction was reached by the species in the year 1927. That which took millions of years to develop was shattered in a few decades, and left Europe without its largest wild mammal and with an urgent call to salvage the bison from total extinction. Yet even in Europe's darkest hour, one last sanctuary still held a glimmer of hope. The last stronghold. By the dawn of the 20th century, Białowieża Forest was one of the last places left on Earth where European bison still roamed. Once protected as a royal hunting preserve and managed with an eye toward conservation, the forest had become a sanctuary for a species that had vanished from most other parts of Europe. Thick woodlands, marshes, and glades gave bison cover and food. But these fragile pockets of safety could not counterbalance the destruction and hunting that surrounded them. Conservationists at the time hoped that this relatively wild stronghold would be enough to help the species hold on. That hope was shattered when World War I broke out. Białowieża, caught between warring empires, became a battleground where forest and wildlife were devastated for military supplies and meat. German occupying troops cut down trees for wood and hunted bison in alarming numbers to feed their ranks. The forest echoed with gunfire, as bison were shot with ease by soldiers equipped with modern firearms. This was the most direct and destructive assault the species had ever faced, wiping out what little was left of Europe's wild bison populations. By the end of the war, scarce bison remained in Białowieża. 9 animals were left in the forest. Even those disappeared in the disorder and lawlessness that followed afterwards. By 1927, European bison were proclaimed extinct in the wild. The remaining few dozen brought to conservation in several zoos and private parks had disappeared by then. Conservationists were devastated all over Europe. The disappearance of the Białowieża wild herd was a strong reminder of how vulnerable species could be in times of political turmoil. But the clear reality was that surviving the bison would require heroic measures. The Białowieża tragedy earned international notoriety. The scientists and naturalists came to realize Europe had lost not just a species, but a species that was a keystone for its wild places. And it was this great loss that energized international cooperation aimed at returning the European bison from the brink. The new legacy of World War I was a continent that would never be the same. But, with that recognition, would find increasingly determined intent to restore its most iconic wildlife. Captive breeding and conservation pioneers. After the last wild European bison was slain in 1927, the future of the species hung by a thread. Only 54 animals survived, all in zoos or small private reserves, and just 12 of these had strong enough genetics to help rebuild the population. Conservationists quickly realized they were running against the clock. Without immediate action, the European bison could follow the wild herd into extinction forever. Even more daunting was the fact that these animals had been living in captivity for generations, and nobody knew if they could ever be successfully returned to a wild landscape. In response to this crisis, a group of pioneering conservationists in Poland, Germany, and Russia began an unprecedented experiment in captive breeding during the 1930s. Every birth was treated like a triumph, with keepers carefully documenting lineage to prevent inbreeding and conserve every trace of genetic diversity. The process was meticulous, slow, and often heartbreaking. Bison reproduce slowly, 1 calf per year at most, so every death was a setback, and every birth became a hopeful sign that the species could be saved. Perhaps the most significant breakthrough was in 1932 with the International Society for the Protection of European Bison. This multinational consortium established a centralized system of breeding and exchanging animals between zoos and parks. Even during political divisions in Europe and the eventual onset of World War II, conservationists kept working together across borders. Records were updated, animals were moved from one facility to another with great care, so as not to create genetic bottlenecks. And gradually, the bison population began to increase. It was one of Europe's first truly collaborative species recovery programs. It showed what can happen when people unite for a common cause. By then, the 1960s and 1970s saw the painstaking breeding efforts re-establish the small cohort into stable captivity. The European bison now resides in bigger enclosures and semi-natural giant parks throughout Europe. What had started as a most desperate rescue effort had given birth to a new lease of life on these species. Conservationists were, by now, dreaming of more than just keeping bison alive. They began to wonder about the possibility of returning these animals to the wild and reinserting them into their rightful ecological niches within Europe's ecosystems. Thanks to these early breeding pioneers, an audacious new chapter was about to begin. Bison, architects of wild Europe. European bison are often thought of as Europe's largest mammal, but they are far more than that. They are a keystone species. Historically, their herds shaped Europe's ecosystems by constantly moving across the landscape. Bison grazed down dense undergrowth and kept meadows and forest edges open and diverse. Every path they took created corridors that allowed smaller species to move through, while their selective feeding and trampling created a mosaic of plant types. Without these giant grazers, Europe's wild places gradually lost their dynamism. Forests became uniform and overgrown, grasslands disappeared under scrub, and the variety of habitats that so many species relied upon diminished. The bison's impact goes far beyond simple grazing. Conservationists have long known that bison serve as natural engineers. By stripping bark and rubbing against trees, they knock down dead wood that other animals can shelter in. Seeds carried in their thick coats disperse across huge areas as bison roam, allowing meadows to reseed and new patches of grass to take hold. Even their dung, a rich fertilizer, jump-starts soil processes and provides food for insects that in turn support birds and small mammals. Their mere presence sets off a cascade of interactions that benefit hundreds of other species. The absence of these processes was quickly felt when European bison vanished from most of their range. Meadows that had once burst with wildflowers and birds fell silent. Forest floors that had been kept open by grazing filled in with dense shrubs, reducing light penetration and stifling plant growth. Without bison breaking up this undergrowth, the natural patchwork of habitats disappeared. Butterflies, bees, and insectivores like foxes and birds of prey lost the food and shelter they had relied on for centuries. This is why bringing European bison back to the wild is about much more than just saving that species. It's about restoring historical processes that make Europe's forests and grasslands come alive. By allowing these animals to graze and move over large, connected areas, conservationists are bringing back the ecosystems that lay silent and dying. Every hoofprint, trail, and wallow is part of a much larger story about how one keystone species can help an entire landscape recover its richness and resilience. Bringing bison back to Tarcu. WWF and Rewilding Europe took a holistic view of this reintroduction, working not only to return the bison, but also to help restore an entire ecosystem. By allowing bison to graze freely across meadows and forest edges, they hope to encourage the return of wildflowers, pollinators, small mammals, and other species that had been missing for decades. The idea was simple yet powerful. If one keystone species could resume its natural behaviors, grazing, trampling, dispersing seeds, the entire food web would begin to rebalance itself. Conservationists believed this hands-off restoration could succeed where traditional management and human intervention had failed. But making that happen on the ground would require much more than good intentions. The landscape was remote and rugged, with few roads, no fences, and a climate that shifted dramatically with the seasons. Rewilding Europe and WWF Romania spent years planning every detail of the project. They carefully selected bison from breeding centers across Europe, choosing animals with diverse genetics and a proven resilience to different habitats. Teams of veterinarians checked each bison to make sure they were healthy enough for the trip and able to cope with the stress of long-distance transport. Even the containers they traveled in were custom designed for their safety and comfort. Upon arrival, the animals were not released all at once into the forest. Conservationists made an important step by creating large acclimation enclosures, large fenced areas meant for the bison to acclimate to their new environment slowly. Here, they familiarized themselves with new types of food, adjusted to the climatic conditions, and regained strength for their journey. Research scientists monitored these animals daily and made detailed records of their behavior and health. Every bison was equipped with a GPS collar that enabled teams to monitor its movement once it became free-ranging, while at the same time allowing for a rapid intervention should one of these animals stray near human settlements. During that time, the team was intent on building bridges into the local communities. Town halls were held to explain the project goals and train and employ nearby villagers as rangers and monitors who could help track the herds. Schools participated in bison-related educational programs aimed at inspiring the next generation of nature stewards. This involvement has been crucial. Locals who had initially feared crop damage or dangerous confrontations eventually became some of the project's greatest advocates. When the first bison stepped onto Tarcu Mountains soil, it was much more than a scientific rewilding effort. It had been forged as a human-nature partnership with a shared vision returning Europe's lost giants home. And just when it seemed the bison had truly come home, the forest began to change in ways no one had predicted. A careful return to nature. After spending several weeks in the acclimation enclosures, the bison began to show clear signs of settling into their new surroundings. They grazed on the local grasses, moved comfortably across the hillsides, and formed close bonds with one another. Conservationists watched carefully for these signs of adjustment before making the decision to open the gates and allow the animals to roam free. Even then, it was a cautious process. Only a few animals were released at a time so the team could track their progress and learn how they navigated their new landscape. Once outside the enclosures, the bison initially stayed close together, their GPS collars providing a real-time map of their movements across the forest. Rangers monitored these signals daily, looking for patterns of behavior that suggested the animals were thriving, foraging normally, choosing sheltered spots to rest, and avoiding places too close to villages. This early data was critical for understanding how the bison used their new habitat and for preventing conflicts with local people. Any sign that animals were approaching farmland would trigger a proactive response, often involving a team of rangers who could gently encourage the bison to move back into wilder areas. As days turned into weeks, bison gradually spread over the high area of the Tarcu Mountains, for some groups remained connected and stayed together in larger herds, whereas smaller adventurous individuals extended their range farther and farther to test the boundaries of this new home. Researchers were thrilled to see signs of natural behavior returning. Wallows were formed in areas where bison rolled in the soils. Trails were cut across dense undergrowth as bison moved, and droppings were spread across the meadows, already enriching soils and spreading seeds of native plants. Each day, the field team collected new evidence that this was more than just survival. The bison were beginning to really act like wild bison again. At the end of the first year, careful optimism had turned into real hope. The animals had survived difficult, icy winters and had been led toward knowledge of where to find food and shelter, which betrayed movements with a confidence only conservationists may have dreamed of. Perhaps most exciting of all was that the animals were not just standing their ground, but were setting things up for future generations to come. Every sign of adaptation made the project closer to that larger goal. A self-sustaining bison herd would be able to reclaim its role as keystone species and, ultimately, bring the whole Tarcu Mountain ecosystem back to life. Struggles and skepticism. Despite the initial setbacks and mounting pressures, the team remained determined to give the bison time to adjust and the landscape a chance to reveal its potential. Every hardship was carefully studied. Biologists examined health data. Veterinarians checked animals for signs of stress or illness, and rangers documented bison movement to look for early behavioral patterns. Conservationists knew that this was a long-term process and that nature rarely followed a tidy, predictable schedule. Meanwhile, the skepticism of locals and some scientists remained an ongoing challenge. Even as rangers worked closely with nearby villages, misunderstandings persisted. Some residents reported seeing bison too close to farms, while others remained unconvinced that these large animals wouldn't cause long-term trouble. Conservationists responded with patience and transparency, sharing updates at village meetings and taking concerned citizens into the field to see the bison's progress firsthand. Slowly, small pockets of support began to emerge as people witnessed the animals adapting and learning to live alongside them. Funding was a behind-the-scenes problem as well. Early successes were few and far between, not cheap, and some international donors grew suspicious of the investment for the long haul. Project managers balanced limited resources against increasing logistical and scientific requirements, a fine balancing act that took constant communication and careful budgeting. But those hurdles were nothing. Teams pressed on by the strong faith that a rewilding project as ambitious as this was never going to be simple or smooth. Every challenge also brought specific learning for the next steps of the project. The collars that failed were redesigned, and a new monitoring protocol was established, which also involved a stronger outreach into the community. Gradually, the bison came to feel more at home in their surroundings, and little gains counted. By 2015, both the researchers and the locals saw signs of what might turn out to be a thriving wild herd. And it was such silver linings that began to change the mood from skepticism to a more cautious optimism. The patience earned by visiting scientists associated with the University of Bucharest with the project is paying off. When local communities and conservation teams work together, this biologist stated, it becomes easier to solve conflicts before they grow. Much like other European projects, like the introduction of bison in Rothaargebirge, Germany, these initiatives show that, with much continued outreach and adaptation, reticent local stakeholders could eventually transform into proud stewards of giants returning to their areas. Birth of wild bison calves. The birth of that first calf wasn't just a biological success. It was a profound signal that the bison were finding their rhythm in the wild. Conservationists knew that reproduction is one of the most telling signs of whether animals are truly at home. That first calf had survived against all odds, harsh winters, unfamiliar food sources, and the stress of the herd's relocation, and its mother had instinctively found the best spots to forage and shelter her young. What had once been a fragile experiment had now become a self-sustaining cycle of life, proof that centuries of captivity had not erased the species' deep natural instincts. As the news of the calf spread, even some of the most skeptical locals began to take note. Farmers who had once worried about their crops began seeing the animals as a symbol of resilience. Nearby villagers spoke of the calf as a kind of lucky charm, a sign that their landscape, once labeled a wilderness desert, was healing itself. Even children in local schools learned about the calf, creating drawings and telling stories about its parents and how they had walked this forest long before humans had settled the region. Cascading ripples of impact reached the conservation team as, after all years of planning, careful management, and stress, That was one powerful moment of validation to witness a healthy calf trotting alongside its mother. Similar births across herds began getting recorded by researchers with the soon-to-be ringing sound of bison calves, who were exploring their terrain. Each and every birth continued to build on this herd's momentum, gradually transforming it into a project that would no longer be kept under prudent human observation, but would instead learn to depend fully on the ability of its animals to survive and thrive. It was more than just a number. That first calf marked a major milestone in a much larger goal: rewilding Europe. It might have been a much more than an existence, having the capability to reclaim its place upon the landscape of a keystone species, bringing back processes long absent. The forest became wilder and livelier with every season passing, and with that calf's birth, the moment came when all could finally believe that Europe's largest wild mammal had indeed come home again. Bison restoration achieved auspicious celebrations locally and internationally as an important step in self-regulating ecosystems. Seeing wild-born bison calves is proof that we are moving from restoration into true rewilding, stated Dr. Iwa Kowalczyk, a bison ecologist at Warsaw University. European Wildlife Society researchers noted that proper reproduction of Tarcu herds could be a model for several similar projects across the continent. Every new calf is more than just one more bison, Kowalczyk noted. It's a confirmation that nature is rewriting its own story, and we are simply here to support it. Ecosystem regeneration and biodiversity. Boom! As the bison roamed more widely across the Tarcu Mountains, their effects became increasingly visible across the landscape. Meadows that had been choked with brush began to open up into patchworks of grass and wildflowers, while forest edges became more dynamic, with different kinds of trees and shrubs sprouting where bison had trampled paths and grazed. Botanists surveying the area reported a surge in plant diversity. Species like orchids, thyme, and daisies began to return, reclaiming soil that had been barren for decades. Each hoofprint became a tiny pocket for seeds to settle and germinate, creating a ripple of renewal across the forest floor. Wildlife soon followed this botanical comeback. Insects appeared first: bees, butterflies, and beetles that thrived on the revived meadows and wildflower patches. Birds such as woodlarks and warblers were next, nesting in the shrubby undergrowth and feasting on the abundant insects. Rangers and researchers began spotting more small mammals like hares and voles, which attracted predators including foxes and owls. Even larger carnivores like lynx and wolves were observed more often as the food web grew richer and more stable. The landscape, once a fading echo of its past, was becoming a living, humming ecosystem once again. Bison improved soil health in dramatic ways as these animals wandered about. Their wallows, muddy patches where they rolled, turned into smaller depressions that filled with water, holding moisture for amphibians and water-loving plants. Beetles and other decomposers broke down bison dung, enriching the soil with nutrients and increasing its water-holding capacity. Dry summers were negotiated by a resilience in the forest that, for so long, had lain dormant, its deeper roots being nourished by this fertilization from nature. It seemed that each bison acted like a gardener, preparing the land so that it would sustain more and more diverse forms of life. Besides species reintroduction, there was a resurrection of an entire process, an ecological engine driven by the bison themselves. Conservationists understood that this was not an ephemeral or delicate enhancement. Instead, it was a long-standing shift in landscape operation. Each field dimmed with colors, every path stamped by heavy bison hooves, Every bird's song heard was an indication that Europe's missing keystone species is returning to restore equilibrium. The forest was not just surviving, it was flourishing. Nature is evidently able to restore itself in an extraordinarily short time and with striking elegance if given the chance. Many scientists from the continent have begun to pay attention to these changes, recognizing the Tarcu Mountains as a powerful example of large-scale restoration. This project is teaching us that we don't always need to micromanage nature. Sometimes, the best thing we can do is let keystone species do the work, said ecologist Franz Scheppers, director of Rewilding Europe. A report out of Wageningen University documents how the return of bison to the Tarcu area has increased insect diversity by more than 30% and doubled soil moisture retention rates on formerly dry slopes. This adds further proof to a work in progress, showing rewilding with large herbivores can kickstart entire ecosystems, proving that, with careful planning and some patience, natural processes can help restore even the most degraded landscapes. Little did they know, this explosion of life was about to spark a far-reaching impact beyond the forest floor. Wild expansion and climate impact. As the bison herd thrived in the Tarcu Mountains, the animals began moving into new territories, well beyond their original release sites. Camera traps and GPS data showed herds traveling across valleys, up steep slopes, and into adjacent protected areas, reclaiming historic migration routes that had been abandoned for centuries. Every mile they roamed created new corridors of life, encouraging native species to follow. Conservationists and park managers celebrated as bison tracks appeared in Domogled-Valea-Kernay National Park, proof that the animals were reconnecting fragmented wildlands across the southern Carpathians. With this expansion came the realization that bison were not just surviving, they were helping the landscape breathe again. Researchers found that the bison's grazing and wallowing stimulated plant growth, allowing a diverse array of wildflowers and grasses to take hold in places that had been choked with underbrush. This richer vegetation absorbed more rainwater, reduced erosion on hillsides, and created soil capable of storing far greater amounts of carbon. A 2023 study estimated that the herd's daily habits, from selective grazing to dung fertilization, helped capture an astonishing 54,000 tons of CO2 annually, equivalent to the emissions of 43,000 cars taken off the road. The bison also proved to be catalysts for larger environmental resilience. Patches of forest previously vulnerable to wildfires began to green up, and areas damaged by heavy rain and snowmelt began to heal faster. By creating natural fire breaks and opening up new grazing spaces, bison helped diversify the landscape into a mosaic of habitats that were better equipped to withstand extreme weather. Even the soil itself became more porous and fertile, drawing water deeper into the ground and replenishing underground aquifers that supported nearby villages. Much more than a feel-good story about the recovery of species, the Bison Rewilding Project became a working model for addressing climate change. Each succeeding year of the expanded viability gave new proof that the conservation of keystone species provides long-term benefits to entire ecosystems and the people who depend on them. Once extinct, European bison are now four-legged stewards of the very landscape they are called to guard, in shaping hillsides, fostering biodiversity, and slowing down climate instability. Starting out 30 years ago as an unfunded and fringe experimental concept from the seed of restoration thought planted in the Tarcu Mountains, today it stands as one of the more potent reminders that restoring wild species is one of the prime tools we have for rekindling the health of the planet. These scientific discoveries have also created a wider appreciation within cultures that the bison has a role to play. Today, seasonal events take place in local villages dedicated to the return of such an animal, while other schools' lessons now include the story of the animal in stewardship and sustainability. Conservation writer George Monbiot even dubbed bison landscape makers, pointing one finger back at those gentle giants for not just adding to the scenery but also actively recovering landscapes. This mix of science, collaboration with the public enthusiasm, has also helped cement regional pride and present support for similar rewilding schemes in the rest of Europe. And that's the incredible story of how European bison began transforming the Tarcu Mountains, one hoofprint at a time. If you enjoyed this journey into Europe's wild revival, give this video a like and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories like this, and make sure to check out the next video on the screen. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you there.